The briefing room had the tired, familiar smell of damp wool and cigarette smoke when the crew filed in just before dusk. It was the kind of evening that usually meant routine work. Low cloud over eastern England, light winds across the channel, nothing in the forecast that suggested anything unusual. On paper, it was supposed to be another standard night operation. The kind men stopped talking about once it was over. The kind that blurred into the growing stack of completed missions. But as the curtain at the front of the room was pulled back to reveal the map, something in the atmosphere shifted. The red thread stretched deep into Germany. No one said anything at first. They didn't have to. Every man in the room understood what distance meant. Distance meant fuel calculations tightened to the margin. But distance meant longer exposure over defended territory. Distance meant fatigue had more time to creep in. Still, the intelligence officer kept his voice calm, almost rehearsed, as he described the target and the expected resistance. Moderate defenses, predictable flak zones, standard night fighter activity, routine. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. By the time the crew stepped back out onto the airfield, night had settled in fully. The perimeter lights cast long, pale reflections across the wet concrete, and the bomber sat waiting in its hard stand, dark and silent, as if conserving its strength. Ground crews moved around it with practiced efficiency, their shapes briefly visible in the glow of shaded lamps before disappearing again into shadow. The pilot walked slowly around the aircraft, a gloved hand trailing along the cold metal skin. He had done this walk before every mission, a habit formed somewhere between superstition and professional discipline. The aircraft had brought them home through enough close calls to earn a certain quiet respect, but tonight, even in the stillness, the machine felt heavier somehow, as if aware of the distance it was being asked to cover. Inside the fuselage, the crew began settling into their stations with the calm economy of men who knew the routine by heart. Oxygen lines were checked, intercom connections tested, maps were unfolded and refolded with careful precision. Each movement carried the quiet weight of repetition, but beneath it ran the steady undercurrent of concentration that never quite went away, no matter how many missions a crew had flown. Engines coughed to life one by one, each ignition sending a deep vibration through the airframe. The sound built gradually into a steady mechanical roar that filled the night and pressed against the chest like a physical force. On the perimeter, a green flare arced upward, hanging briefly against the cloud base before fading. Time to go. The bomber rolled forward into the slow procession toward the runway, joining the long line of aircraft inching through the darkness. Taxi lights remained dimmed, each crew following the shadowed outline of the aircraft ahead. From the cockpit, the pilot could see the faint glow of exhaust flames licking back from the engines in front of them, small flickers of orange swallowed quickly by the night. When their turn came, the bomber eased onto the runway and paused. Final checks came quickly now. Engine reading steady, mixture set, flaps positioned. The co-pilot's voice was calm over the intercom, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there earlier. Not fear, exactly, just awareness. The throttles advanced. The aircraft surged forward, gathering speed across the damp runway as the engines climbed into a full-throated roar. For a moment, the bomber felt impossibly heavy, wheels clinging to the ground longer than seemed comfortable. Then the airspeed needle crept past the mark, and the pilot eased back gently on the controls. The ground fell away beneath them. Almost immediately, the aircraft was swallowed by low cloud. The outside world vanished into gray-black haze, leaving only the steady vibration of the engines and the dim instrument glow inside the cockpit. Moisture streaked across the windscreen in thin, shifting lines. Somewhere behind them, but the rest of the bomber stream was clawing its way into the same heavy sky. The climb settled into its familiar rhythm, but the navigator was already leaning closer to his charts than usual, pencil moving in small, deliberate marks. The route was longer tonight, the margins thinner. Even small navigational errors would carry consequences hours later over hostile territory. At altitude, the bomber leveled off and turned east. The English coastline slid slowly beneath the cloud gaps, visible only in brief, ghost-like glimpses through breaks in the overcast. Below, the channel waited in darkness. Above, the sky remained stubbornly overcast, the moon hidden somewhere beyond the thick cloud layer. Inside the aircraft, conversation dwindled to essential communication only. The crew settled into the patient stretch that always came before the real tension began. It was during this phase that time seemed to behave strangely, minutes stretching and compressing in uneven ways. the monotony broken only by the steady hum of engines and the occasional course correction. But even now, small things were beginning to feel different. Radio traffic was heavier than expected, though tightly controlled. The bomber stream felt denser tonight, the spacing between aircraft slightly tighter as they formed up over the coast. And far ahead, barely visible through a thin break in the cloud, there was a faint, intermittent flicker on the distant horizon. It might have been lightning, or it might have been something else. No one said it out loud yet, but the longer they flew east, the more the quiet confidence from the briefing room began to thin, but replaced by a slow, creeping awareness that the night ahead might not follow the comfortable script they had been given, and they were still a long way from Germany. The bomber stream settled into its long eastward arc with the quiet inevitability of something too large to easily change course. From altitude, the English coastline had already faded behind them, swallowed by cloud and distance, leaving only the steady black expanse of the channel below. Inside the aircraft, the early adrenaline of takeoff had given way to the familiar waiting period that every experienced crew understood well. This was the stretch where discipline mattered most, when fatigue tried to creep in early and small mistakes had room to grow unnoticed. The pilot kept his hands light on the controls, in making minor corrections almost by instinct as the aircraft held formation. Off the port side, another bomber maintained its assigned position, its dark silhouette occasionally appearing when the cloud thinned enough for faint starlight to filter through. Navigation lights remained carefully masked, each aircraft relying on careful spacing and practiced judgment to avoid drifting too close. It was a delicate balance, one the crews had rehearsed repeatedly, but tonight the air felt more crowded than usual. Behind the cockpit, the navigator worked steadily under the dim red glow of his lamp. The route across the channel was straightforward, but beyond the European coastline, the path narrowed through corridors of known defenses and estimated radar coverage. His pencil moved in small, deliberate strokes, confirming wind drift and ground speed, quietly recalculating the margins that would matter hours later. Every few minutes, he checked his watch, comparing time against distance, building a mental picture of where they needed to be at each stage of the run. The wireless operator monitored the steady flow of coded transmissions passing through the bomber stream. Most were routine position confirmations, brief and tightly controlled, but the volume itself carried meaning. There were more aircraft in the air tonight than the briefing had fully suggested. The scale of the operation was beginning to reveal itself not through official numbers, but through the density of voices moving across the radio spectrum. As they pushed farther east, the weather began to change. The cloud layer thinned unevenly, breaking into wide, ragged gaps that exposed the dark surface of the channel far below. Cold air seeped gradually into the fuselage, the temperature dropping enough that breath began to fog faintly inside oxygen masks. Frost started forming in thin crystals along the inner edges of the cockpit framing, a quiet reminder of the altitude they were maintaining. Formation discipline tightened. The bomber stream compressed slightly as navigators across dozens of aircraft made similar wind corrections. From the pilot's seat, the sky ahead now carried the faint, intermittent shimmer of distant light, not bright enough yet to define, but persistent enough to notice. It appeared low on the horizon, flickering unevenly through the haze. No one commented immediately, but several sets of eyes lingered on it longer than before. But crossing the European coastline always marked a psychological shift, and the crew felt it even before the navigator confirmed their position. Over the channel, there was still the quiet comfort of distance. Over occupied territory, the margin for error narrowed sharply. Every mile forward now brought them deeper into the range of radar stations, searchlights, and night fighter bases that dotted the landscape below. The first sign came not from the sky, but from the wireless operator's headphones. Enemy radar activity had been expected, but the pattern tonight was heavier, more coordinated. Ground stations were already tracking the bomber stream earlier than usual. The information passed quietly through the intercom, not as alarm, but as awareness. The crew absorbed it the same way seasoned airmen always did, without wasted reaction, but with a subtle tightening of focus. Outside, the distant flicker on the horizon was growing brighter. At first, it looked almost like heat lightning beyond the clouds, soft pulses of pale illumination that faded as quickly as they appeared. But as the bomber stream pressed forward, the character of the light changed. It became more structured, more rhythmic. The navigator noticed it next, pausing briefly over his charts before leaning slightly toward the forward canopy. Searchlights, still far ahead, still diffused by distance and atmosphere, but unmistakable. The pilot adjusted his grip on the controls, not dramatically, just enough that the co-pilot noticed. Formation remained steady, engines running smoothly, instruments all within expected limits. On paper, nothing had changed. But the quiet understanding inside the aircraft was beginning to shift. German defenses were fully alert tonight. The intercom remained professional and measured, but communication frequency increased slightly as each crew station verified their readiness. Gun turrets were checked again. Oxygen flow confirmed. Fuel calculations quietly rechecked against the longer than comfortable route ahead. These were not signs of panic. They were the small, methodical adjustments of a crew that recognized the environment was becoming less predictable. Below them, the first scattered bursts of anti-aircraft fire appeared, distant and low, well ahead of the main formation, like brief orange blossoms opening and closing in the darkness. They were not yet within effective range, but their presence carried weight. The German gunners were already probing the sky, already attempting to gauge altitude and timing. The bomber continued forward. Inside the fuselage, the earlier sense of routine had thinned noticeably, replaced by something quieter and more focused. No one spoke about it directly. Experienced crews rarely did. But the longer they watched the sky ahead grow brighter with organized defense, the clearer it became that tonight's mission was unfolding under very different conditions than the calm language of the briefing had suggested. And they were still only approaching the outer edge of Germany's night defenses. Crossing the last band of cloud, the bomber slid into a colder, clearer layer of night air, and the world below sharpened into black fields and faint, winding rivers. The navigator confirmed landfall in a clipped voice, and the pilot answered without looking away from the instruments. Engines were synchronized, the aircraft steady, yet the sky ahead carried a harder kind of light now. Searchlights rising in slow, probing sweeps, their beams fanning across the underside of the clouds as if feeling for movement. The first flak came as a distant thump, more vibration than sound, a dull percussion that traveled through the airframe and into the crew's ribs. At this range, it was still scattered, the bursts low and small, but the gunners were walking their fire upward in careful steps. The pilot held course, resisting the urge to weave too early, because every unnecessary movement cost fuel and loosened formation spacing. Around them, the bomber stream remained a dark procession, each aircraft trusting the discipline of the others to keep the night from turning into a collision. Minutes later, the flak thickened with unsettling speed. It was no longer a few isolated puffs, but a belt of bursts that climbed toward them like a rising tide. The intercom crackled with efficient reports from other crews, altitude checks, minor damage, calls to maintain intervals. Never dramatic, just the working language of men trying to keep a system intact under pressure. A burst went off close enough to slap the cockpit windows with flat pressure, and the bomber ahead dipped slightly, correcting itself before drifting into their lane. Outside, the night grew crowded with violence. Bursts filled the air in layered depths, some far below, some uncomfortably near. Inside the fuselage, the sound became constant, irregular hammering, like heavy doors being slammed in rapid succession. In the rear turret, the gunner watched the sky behind them, strobe with orange flashes where shells detonated, each one leaving a brief afterimage. He could make out other bombers as silhouettes caught in that flicker, holding position stubbornly, because breaking formation here could be as dangerous as staying in it. The pilot began making measured adjustments, not wild, evasive turns that would scatter the stream, but small heading changes and slight altitude corrections to keep away from the densest concentrations. The navigator tracked each change, calling it back so the pilot could return to the planned route without drifting. Every correction was a compromise between survival and the mathematics of the mission. The aircraft felt exposed, a large, slow thing suspended in an enemy's prepared killing zone. A larger burst detonated off the starboard wing with a flash that flooded the cockpit in harsh light. The bomber jolted as if struck by a giant fist. A metallic rattle ran through the fuselage, followed by a brief hiss somewhere aft. The flight engineer's voice came on immediately, controlled but sharper, reporting shrapnel holes and a leak in an oxygen line. The pilot acknowledged and told him to isolate it, tone flat, as if speaking about a routine gauge reading. In the midsection, the engineer and radio operator moved carefully in the cramped darkness, boots finding familiar footholds as the aircraft shuddered. The engineer worked by touch along the rubber line until he found the puncture, then applied a clamp with deliberate pressure and checked the gauge again. The hiss faded. It was a small victory, barely worth words, but it steadied the crew's sense of control. They were still intact. The aircraft was still flying. Approaching the inner defensive ring, searchlights multiplied below, their beams sweeping higher and intersecting into bright cones that briefly outlined aircraft in stark relief. When a beam caught a bomber, others converged, turning the sky into a luminous net. The crew watched as a neighboring aircraft was trapped for several seconds, its silhouette frozen in white. Flak clustered around it, walking closer. Then the beam slipped, and the bomber vanished back into darkness, still moving but now trailing a thin ribbon of smoke. The pilot kept their aircraft just below the thickest light layer, trusting altitude and speed more than luck. The co-pilot called airspeed, while the engineer monitored power settings and the navigator fed steady corrections as wind drift tried to push them off course. The bombardier remained at his station, adjusting his equipment, listening for the moment the target run would begin. He could smell cordite faintly, carried up from thousands of detonations below, a bitter metallic tang that seemed to coat the back of the throat. Another concussion struck, closer than the last, and fragments pinged off the fuselage like hail on a tin roof. The tail gunner reported a tear near his position and a brief flicker in turret power, but it stabilized. Over the radio came a warning from the formation controller. Defenses were heavier than anticipated. Maintain discipline. Hold altitude. The message carried no comfort, but it confirmed what every crew already knew. But the mission had moved fully out of the realm of routine. Yet amid the chaos, the stream held together. Aircraft continued forward, engines droning, men clinging to procedure as the only reliable structure left. The pilot's hands remained steady. The navigator's pencil began moving again, slower now, correcting each deviation. Germany itself was largely invisible beneath the darkness, but its defenses made its presence undeniable. A country awake and armed, throwing everything it could into the night sky. And still, mile by mile, the bombers pushed on toward the distant glow of industry, carrying their loads into the heart of the war. Inside the cockpit, the pilot felt the aircraft's responses change with each shockwave, the controls briefly going loose and then firm again as the pressure passed. Only sweat collected under his helmet despite the cold, and he forced himself to blink, to keep his eyes from narrowing into a fixed stare. The co-pilot drank from his canteen in tiny sips, careful not to fog his mask, and the two men spoke only when necessary again. By the time the bomber stream reached the inner defensive belt, the sky over Germany had transformed into something far more organized and deliberate. What had begun as scattered resistance now moved with coordination. Searchlights no longer wandered blindly. They worked in disciplined patterns, rising in controlled arcs that overlapped like the ribs of an enormous cage. Beneath them, the glow from industrial cities seeped upward through the haze, dull red smears on the horizon that marked the target area drawing closer. Inside the aircraft, the crew felt the shift immediately. The wireless operator picked up the first signs of night fighter control traffic threading through the static. It came in short bursts of coded German transmissions, precise, clipped, and frequent enough to suggest a network already fully engaged. The information passed forward over the intercom without drama, but the effect inside the fuselage was unmistakable. Flak could be endured with discipline and luck. Night fighters required something more personal. The rear gunner was the first to see movement in the darkness behind them. At first, it was only a suggestion, a shape that did not quite belong to the steady procession of bombers. He leaned forward slightly in his turret, adjusting the sight, watching the patch of sky with the patient stillness that came from long hours on watch. Then the shape resolved itself in a brief flash of reflected light, a twin-engine silhouette sliding across the bomber stream's wake. "Possible bandit low 6, he reported, voice controlled but tight. The pilot did not break formation. Instead, he made a small adjustment to power and heading, the kind that preserved the bomber's position while subtly complicating an attacker's approach. Around them, the stream held together, but the atmosphere inside the aircraft shifted again. Less about endurance now, more about immediate survival. Within minutes, more fighters appeared. They came in from different angles, dark forms slipping between the searchlight beams, using the flak bursts as cover. Tracer fire suddenly stitched the sky several hundred yards off the starboard side, bright lines arcing upward toward another bomber in the formation. While the attacked aircraft shuddered violently, dropped slightly, and then struggled back into position, one engine beginning to glow a dull, unhealthy orange. Inside their own fuselage, the crew tightened into their roles. The gunners scanned continuously now, eyes moving in disciplined patterns to avoid fixation. The pilot maintained speed and altitude with careful precision, knowing that sudden evasive maneuvers could break the protective geometry of the stream. The bombardier double-checked his equipment again, though the target was still minutes away. Every man understood that the next phase of the mission would demand absolute coordination. Another fighter made a pass from below. The belly gunner opened fire first, twin streams of tracers reaching downward into the dark. The aircraft shuddered lightly as the guns vibrated through the fuselage. For a moment, the enemy fighter's shape became visible in the crossing light, sleek, fast, and already breaking away. Whether hit or simply deterred, it vanished quickly back into the black. No one celebrated. Encounters like that rarely ended cleanly. The pilot's voice came calmly over the intercom, reminding the crew to conserve ammunition and maintain scan discipline. His tone remained even, but the effort behind it showed in the slight tightening of his words. Around them, the sky had grown increasingly chaotic. Flak bursts continued to blossom in layered patterns while searchlights probed relentlessly upward. Through it all, the night fighters moved with unsettling patience, waiting for isolated aircraft or moments of confusion. Ahead, while the target area's glow intensified, what had been a faint smear earlier was now a broad, uneven wash of red and orange on the horizon. Smoke from earlier strikes drifted upward in slow, towering columns that caught the searchlight beams and diffused them into ghostly curtains. The navigator confirmed their approach timing, his voice steady but more frequent now as he fed the pilot small corrections. The formation began its subtle compression for the bombing run. Intervals tightened. Speeds stabilized. The bomber stream, despite losses and damage, pulled itself into the disciplined shape required for accurate delivery. It was one of the most dangerous moments of the mission, when aircraft became most predictable, most exposed. But it was also the point where training and coordination mattered most. Now the crew felt the aircraft settle into that rigid forward commitment. Flak intensified again as German batteries concentrated their fire directly along the bomber approach lanes. Bursts came closer now, some rocking the aircraft hard enough to rattle loose equipment. The engineer called out minor pressure fluctuations in one engine, but quickly reported it holding steady. For now, the bomber remained fully operational. Another fighter pass developed behind them, but this time the tail gunner's warning came earlier. Defensive fire from several bombers in the stream converged quickly, filling the attacker's approach path with tracer lines. The enemy aircraft broke off before closing to effective range, slipping away into the layered darkness once more. Inside the cockpit, the pilot allowed himself one slow breath. But the mission had fully revealed its character now. Nothing about this night resembled the calm expectations of the briefing room. Every mile forward had been contested, every phase more heavily defended than predicted. Yet the aircraft was still intact. The crew was still functioning as a unit, and the target lay directly ahead, burning faintly through the smoke and cloud like a warning beacon. The bombardier moved into final preparation. His gloved hands made careful adjustments, eyes already fixed forward through the sighting equipment as the aircraft held its steady course into the most dangerous stretch of the night. The glow ahead thickened into a wide, uneven blaze that pulsed through the haze, and the bombardier leaned deeper over his sight, shoulders hunched to steady the view. But the aircraft held its line with a deliberate steadiness that felt almost unnatural after the long minutes of shock and vibration. Around them, the bomber stream compressed into a narrow corridor of engines and shadow, each crew settling into the quiet, disciplined focus required for the run. Below, the target area revealed itself in fragments through smoke breaks, rail yards, industrial roofs, the faint geometry of streets barely visible beneath the growing fires. Earlier waves had already struck. Pockets of flame burned in scattered clusters, their light reflecting off the underside of the cloud layer in a dull, angry glow. German defenses had not slackened. If anything, the concentration of flak grew denser as the formation approached the release point, the bursts climbing upward in carefully timed brackets. Inside the cockpit, the pilot locked the aircraft into the bombing run heading. From this moment forward, evasive maneuvering would be minimal. Accuracy depended on steadiness. Every instinct in his body urged small corrections to dodge the thickening bursts outside, but discipline held his hands steady on the controls. The co-pilot called out airspeed and altitude in a low, even rhythm, the numbers forming a quiet metronome beneath the rising tension. The bombardier's voice came over the intercom, calm but clipped, announcing he was taking control for the final approach. The aircraft responded subtly as the automatic stabilizing inputs guided it onto the precise line toward the target. In the nose compartment, the bombardier adjusted for wind drift, his world narrowing to crosshairs, ground movement, and the slow, relentless closing of distance. The flak erupted closer. A burst off the port wing flashed so bright it momentarily washed the cockpit in white. The aircraft jolted, not violently but enough to remind everyone how thin the aluminum skin was between them and the fragments tearing through the air. The engineer scanned his panel quickly. Engine temperatures remained within limits. Fuel pressure steady. For the moment, the bomber was still whole. Behind them, the gunners continued their patient watch. Night fighters had not disappeared, but the density of the flak and searchlights around the target forced them into more cautious approaches. Occasional tracer streaks still cut through the darkness at the edges of the formation, but no aircraft closed aggressively. The real threat now came from the ground. The target markers ahead burned brighter. The Pathfinder flares hung in the air like suspended suns, drifting slowly on their parachutes and casting harsh white pools of light across the industrial district below. Smoke curled upward through the illumination, turning the scene into something almost unreal, bright and shadowed at the same time. The bombardier made a final correction, breath slow inside the oxygen mask. Bomb doors open. The engineer moved immediately, flipping the controls. A deep mechanical vibration ran through the fuselage as the doors beneath the bomber slid apart. Cold air surged upward through the aircraft's belly, carrying with it the sharp metallic smell of high altitude. The aircraft felt subtly different now, the altered airflow tugging faintly at the controls. Seconds stretched. The pilot held the bomber exactly on heading, each resisting the urge to react to the heavy bursts now walking ever closer. The co-pilot's steady altitude call continued without pause. Inside the nose, the bombardier tracked the crosshairs across the illuminated ground features, waiting for the precise alignment drilled into him through months of training. Below, the fires flickered and spread. Then the bombardier spoke one word: release. The aircraft lurched upward almost imperceptibly as the bomb load fell away into the darkness. The sudden lightness passed through the airframe like a breath being let out. Beneath them, the bombs dropped in silent succession, vanishing into the smoke and glare below. A few seconds later, the first detonations blossomed across the target zone, sharp flashes that merged quickly into the growing field of fire. Bombs gone! On doors closing. The engineer reversed the controls, and the heavy panels beneath the aircraft slid shut again, sealing the cold rush from the fuselage. The pilot immediately began the planned turn off the target line, careful but firm, guiding the bomber back into the protective flow of the stream. Only now did evasive maneuvering return in full. Flak followed them out. German gunners continued firing as the formation withdrew, their bursts now trailing behind the bombers in thick clusters. One detonation rocked the aircraft sharply from below, strong enough to make the control column shudder in the pilot's hands. The engineer reported superficial damage along the lower fuselage, but no critical systems affected. It was close, but still survivable. As the bomber pulled away from the burning target, though the crew finally allowed themselves brief, measured breaths. The most exposed phase of the mission had passed, but the return journey remained long and uncertain. Fuel calculations would matter, engine strain would matter, and the night fighters, though cautious near the target, would likely be waiting along the withdrawal routes. Behind them, the industrial district burned steadily, its glow spreading wider through the cloud base. Inside the aircraft, the earlier illusion of routine was completely gone. Every man aboard understood now how narrow the margin had been, how quickly a standard operation had hardened into something far more demanding. Yet the bomber still flew. The engines still held their rhythm, and for the moment, the crew remained together, turning slowly westward into the long, cold night home. But the turn westward felt heavier than the approach had, as if the aircraft itself understood the distance still ahead. With the bomb load gone, the bomber climbed slightly more easily, but the sense of exposure had not eased. The sky behind them remained active, flak bursts still blooming in uneven clusters as German batteries fired after the withdrawing stream. Inside the cockpit, the pilot kept his movements measured, careful not to overcorrect as the aircraft settled into its outbound heading. Fuel became the first quiet concern. The navigator and engineer compared figures in low, steady voices over the intercom, recalculating consumption now that the aircraft had absorbed several evasive maneuvers and the long approach through heavy defenses. The numbers were still within acceptable margins, but only just. That the extended route and the denser than expected resistance had narrowed the buffer they normally carried home. No one said the word aloud, but the meaning was clear. Efficiency now mattered more than ever. Behind them, the tail gunner continued scanning the dark lanes of sky. Night fighters often waited along the withdrawal routes, picking off bombers that had fallen slightly out of position or slowed by damage. The earlier contacts had been cautious near the target, but farther west, the German crews would have more room to maneuver. The gunner shifted slightly in his turret, adjusting his shoulders against the growing stiffness that came from hours in the cold. The aircraft shuddered briefly as the pilot introduced a shallow course adjustment to avoid a thicker band of flak that still lingered below. It was lighter now, less concentrated than over the target, but still present enough to demand attention. The co-pilot read back the new heading while the navigator marked the deviation and began calculating the correction needed to bring them smoothly back onto the planned exit corridor. Fatigue was beginning to show itself. It came not as sudden exhaustion, but as small creeping effects. The pilot blinking a fraction longer between instrument scans, the navigator pausing half a second more over his chart lines, the engineer flexing his gloved fingers to keep circulation moving, oxygen masks muffled breathing into slow, mechanical rhythms that filled the quieter stretches between intercom calls. The adrenaline of the bombing run had faded, leaving behind the long, grinding concentration of the return leg. A brief flicker off the starboard quarter drew immediate attention. The tail gunner leaned forward, tracking carefully. For several seconds, nothing resolved clearly through the darkness and haze. Then a thin line of tracer fire arced upward from below and behind, distant but unmistakable. Another night fighter was probing the stream, still outside effective range but closing cautiously. The pilot did not break formation. Instead, he increased power slightly, bringing the aircraft into a marginally tighter position within the bomber flow. Nearby bombers held their spacing, each crew clearly aware of the renewed threat. Defensive gunners across the formation began more deliberate scan patterns, their turrets moving with slow, methodical sweeps. The enemy fighter made a tentative approach but never fully committed. A defensive tracer from several bombers stitched across its path, forcing it to break away before closing distance. Within moments, it disappeared again into the darkness, leaving only the fading memory of its presence. Inside the fuselage, tension eased only slightly. The engineer ran another quick systems check, his voice calm as he reported all engines still holding within safe temperature ranges. The earlier shrapnel damage had not worsened, though a faint vibration had developed along the lower fuselage, likely minor skin damage catching the slipstream. For now, it remained manageable. The navigator finally confirmed they were approaching the outer edge of the heaviest German defenses. Below, the density of flak bursts had thinned considerably, and the searchlight patterns no longer reached their altitude. The sky ahead looked darker, but less crowded with the artificial glare that had marked the target zone. It was not safety yet, but it was movement in the right direction. Still, the journey home stretched long. Cold continued to seep through the aircraft's thin skin, working into joints and muscles despite the heavy flight gear. The crew moved carefully when they had to shift position, conserving energy where possible. Conversation remained sparse, focused entirely on essential updates. The professionalism that had carried them through the target run now settled into a quieter endurance. As the bomber pushed farther west, the wireless operator finally reported a subtle but welcome change in the radio environment. German ground control traffic faded gradually, replaced by the more familiar patterns of Allied monitoring stations beginning to pick up the returning stream. It was not yet the comfort of home airspace, but it marked the slow transition away from the deepest danger. The pilot allowed himself a brief glance at the fuel gauges again. The numbers were still tight, but steady. Outside, the horizon ahead remained dark and empty, the fires of Germany now far behind them. The aircraft pressed on through the cold night, engines droning with stubborn consistency, carrying its weary crew mile by mile back toward the channel and the fragile safety waiting beyond it. The channel did not appear all at once. It emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, as the bomber pushed west through the thinning haze. For a long time, the world outside remained nothing but layered darkness and scattered cloud, the kind of empty sky that made distance difficult to judge. Then, gradually, but the navigator confirmed what the crew had been waiting to hear. They were nearing the coast. Germany's defenses were finally falling behind them. Inside the aircraft, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. No one relaxed fully. Experienced crews rarely did until wheels were firmly on English concrete, but the edge that had defined the past hour softened slightly. The pilot allowed the aircraft to settle into a more economical cruise, easing the engines just enough to preserve fuel without sacrificing formation spacing. The steady drone inside the cockpit lowered by a fraction, and the engineer watched his gauges with careful approval. Below them, the flak had disappeared completely. Searchlights no longer clawed at the cloud base. The sky ahead looked darker and emptier. The organized violence of the target area replaced by the long, cold quiet of open water. Still, the return leg demanded concentration. Night fighters occasionally ranged far out over the channel, and mechanical failures had a way of revealing themselves only after the worst of the mission had passed. Fatigue now settled heavily across the crew. It showed in small ways. The navigator rolled his shoulders slowly between position checks. The tail gunner flexed stiff fingers inside heavy gloves. The pilot blinked more deliberately as he scanned his instruments, forcing his focus to remain sharp. Hours of controlled tension had drained them more than any of them would openly admit. The wireless operator began picking up stronger Allied signals, the familiar cadence of friendly monitoring stations threading through his headphones. He passed the information forward. And for the first time since the bombing run, the co-pilot allowed himself a slow breath that fogged faintly inside his oxygen mask. They were almost home. The English coastline finally appeared as a faint, uneven shadow beneath a break in the cloud. It was not dramatic, no sudden sense of triumph, just the quiet confirmation that the long night over enemy territory had ended. The navigator marked their position carefully, then began feeding the pilot the gradual course adjustments needed to bring them back toward their assigned airfield. Fuel remained tight, but sufficient. The engineer double-checked the remaining figures, mentally running through the same calculations he had already completed twice before. The aircraft had taken minor damage, but nothing that threatened immediate performance. The engines still held their steady rhythm, each vibration now familiar and reassuring. As they crossed inland, the first controlled lights of eastern England appeared far below, dim, carefully shielded points that contrasted sharply with the chaotic glare they had left behind over Germany. Ground control acknowledged their approach in calm, measured tones, assigning them to the landing sequence already forming above the base. The bomber began its gradual descent. Cold air thickened slightly as altitude dropped, and the aircraft's controls responded with a heavier, more grounded feel. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's movements remained precise but carried a trace of accumulated wear. The co-pilot worked through the landing checklist in steady sequence, his voice quieter now, but still controlled. Landing lights from the airfield appeared ahead, faint at first, and then slowly sharpening through the darkness. The final approach always carried its own quiet tension. Even after surviving flak and fighters, many crews had learned not to take the last minutes for granted. The pilot lined the aircraft carefully with the runway, adjusting throttle and trim with practiced sensitivity. The heavy bomber responded obediently, though the earlier vibration along the lower fuselage remained faintly present. Wheels lowered. The engineer confirmed gear down and locked, his eyes moving quickly across the panel one last time. The runway lights stretched toward them in a straight, narrow line. The pilot held the glide steady, easing power back in small increments. The bomber touched down with a firm, controlled thump. For a brief moment, the aircraft shuddered across the runway surface, tires humming loudly against the concrete. Then speed bled away, and the pilot brought the bomber gently under full control. The long mission was finally, physically over. Only then did the crew begin to feel it. Not relief exactly, something quieter, heavier. As the aircraft taxied slowly back toward dispersal, ground crews moved into position, their figures appearing out of the darkness under shaded lamps. The engines wound down one by one, the deep mechanical roar fading into an unfamiliar silence that pressed against the ears. Inside the fuselage, the men remained at their stations for a few seconds longer than necessary. Hours earlier, the mission had been described as routine. Now, each of them understood how narrow the margin had truly been. The heavier defenses, the coordinated fighters, the tightening fuel calculations. And none of it had been visible in the calm language of the briefing room. When they finally climbed down onto the cold English concrete, the night air felt strangely still. Behind them, the bomber sat scarred but intact, thin holes peppering sections of its fuselage where fragments had come too close. Ground crews were already moving in, flashlights probing the damage with quiet efficiency. The war over Germany was not easing. If anything, it was becoming more organized, more heavily defended, more unforgiving with each passing month. Tonight had made that reality unmistakably clear. And as the crew walked slowly toward debriefing, boots heavy on the damp ground, each man carried the same unspoken understanding. The briefing room smelled of damp wool and stale cigarette smoke when the crew filed in just after dusk. The kind of ordinary, tired atmosphere that usually meant the night ahead would follow a familiar pattern. Boots scraped quietly against the wooden floor as the men took their seats, each of them carrying the restrained calm of crews who had already seen enough missions to understand the rhythm of these evenings. Nothing in the airfield chatter outside had suggested anything unusual. On paper, this operation was expected to be routine. Another long night over Germany, another careful run in and out. But when the curtain at the front of the room was pulled aside, the atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. The red thread on the operations map stretched farther east than most of them had expected. No one spoke. They did not need to. Distance had its own language in Bomber Command, and every man in the room understood what it meant. The longer distance meant tighter fuel margins. It meant more time exposed over defended territory. It meant fewer comfortable options if something went wrong deep inside Germany. Still, the intelligence officer kept his voice measured and controlled as he outlined the target and expected resistance. Moderate flak, predictable night fighter activity, standard conditions, routine. The word lingered longer than it should have. By the time the briefing ended and the crew stepped back into the cold evening air, the sky over eastern England had settled into a thick, low overcast. The airfield lights glowed dim and carefully shielded, throwing pale reflections across the wet concrete. Their bomber waited on its hard stand, dark and motionless. Ground crew figures moving quietly around its wings like shadows performing a familiar ritual. Then the pilot began his slow walk around the aircraft, gloved hand trailing lightly across the cold aluminum skin. He performed the same circuit before every mission, partly habit, partly discipline, and partly something he never bothered to name. The aircraft had carried them home more than once under difficult circumstances. It had earned a certain respect. Tonight, however, the machine felt heavier somehow, as if the long route but already weighed on its frame. Inside the fuselage, the rest of the crew moved through their checks with calm efficiency. Oxygen lines were tested, intercom connections confirmed. Charts unfolded beneath the navigator's dim red lamp. Every motion was deliberate and economical, the practiced choreography of men who understood that small oversights at this stage had a way of growing larger in the dark hours ahead. One by one, the engines coughed to life. The deep vibration rolled through the airframe, building steadily into a full mechanical roar that filled the night air. The smell of hot oil and exhaust drifted faintly through the cockpit vents. Outside, a green flare arced upward from the control point, briefly illuminating the low cloud base before fading back into darkness. It was time. The bomber began to taxi, joining the slow procession of aircraft moving toward the runway. Dim navigation lights flickered ahead through the mist as each crew followed the shadowed outline of the aircraft in front of them. The movement was patient, controlled, almost quiet, despite the combined weight of engines and machinery preparing for the long flight east. When their turn came, the pilot eased the bomber onto the runway and held it steady. Final checks came quickly now. Engine temperatures steady, mixtures set, flaps positioned. The co-pilot's voice moved through the checklist in a calm, even cadence, though there was a subtle tightness beneath it that only the most experienced crews learned to recognize. Not fear, just awareness. The throttles moved forward. The bomber surged ahead, gathering speed across the damp runway as the engines climbed into a full, thunderous roar. For a moment, the aircraft felt stubbornly heavy, wheels clinging to the ground longer than seemed comfortable. Then the airspeed needle crept past the mark, and the pilot eased back gently on the controls. The ground fell away beneath them. Almost immediately, they were swallowed by cloud. The outside world vanished into gray-black haze, leaving only the steady vibration of the engines and the soft glow of instruments inside the cockpit. Moisture streaked across the windscreen in thin, shifting lines. Somewhere behind them, dozens of other bombers were climbing into the same heavy sky. The ascent settled into its familiar rhythm, but the navigator was already leaning closer to his charts than usual, pencil moving in small, careful marks. The route was long tonight. Margins would be narrow. Even minor navigational drift could matter hours later over hostile territory. At altitude, the bomber leveled and turned east. Through occasional breaks in the cloud, the English coastline appeared briefly below, pale and ghost-like in the darkness before slipping away again. Conversation inside the aircraft faded to essential communication only. Each crew member settled into the long, quiet stretch that always came before the real tension began. But even now, small things felt slightly different. Radio traffic seemed heavier than expected. The bomber stream felt more tightly packed than usual as aircraft formed up over the coast. And far ahead, barely visible through a thin gap in the cloud layer, a faint, uneven flicker touched the distant horizon. It might have been distant lightning, or it might have been something else. No one said anything yet, but as the bomber pressed steadily eastward into the night, the quiet confidence that had filled the briefing room began to thin, replaced by the slow, professional awareness that this mission might not follow the comfortable pattern they had been promised. They were still a long way from Germany. The bomber stream stretched across the night sky in a slow, deliberate arc, each aircraft holding its assigned place with practiced precision as they moved steadily away from the English coast. Behind them, the faint outline of home had already dissolved into cloud and distance, leaving only the dark expanse of the channel below. Inside the aircraft, the early surge of takeoff had faded into the long, controlled rhythm that defined the early phase of every mission. The pilot kept the bomber trimmed carefully, hands light but attentive on the controls. Minor adjustments came almost without thought now, small corrections to hold position within the stream while preserving fuel and engine strain. Off the port side, another bomber hovered in and out of view through the broken cloud, its shadowed form occasionally revealed when thin starlight filtered through the overcast. Navigation lights remained masked, and spacing depended entirely on the judgment of men who had repeated this careful dance many times before. Behind the cockpit, the navigator worked beneath the steady red glow of his lamp. His charts were already marked with fresh pencil lines, wind drift corrections, and timing checks that would matter more with every mile east. The route ahead narrowed through known defensive corridors, and he quietly recalculated ground speed to account for the subtle headwind they were now encountering. Every few minutes, he cross-checked the aircraft's position against his watch, building a precise mental picture of where they should be and how little margin the long flight allowed. The wireless operator monitored the steady stream of coded transmissions passing through his headphones. Most messages were routine acknowledgments and position confirmations, brief and tightly controlled, but the volume itself told a larger story. There were more aircraft in the air tonight than the briefing had suggested. The scale of the operation was revealing itself through radio traffic and the growing density of the formation around them. As they pushed farther east, the weather began to shift. The cloud layer broke unevenly, opening wide gaps that exposed the dark surface of the channel far below. Cold seeped gradually into the fuselage, the temperature dropping enough that breath began to fog faintly inside oxygen masks. Frost started forming in thin, delicate patterns along the edges of the cockpit framing. The engineer adjusted heating flow where he could, but at this altitude, the cold always found its way in. While formation discipline tightened almost automatically, navigators across the stream made similar wind corrections, and the bombers compressed slightly as each crew worked to maintain proper spacing. From the cockpit, the sky ahead now showed the faintest shimmer of distant light, low on the horizon and flickering irregularly through the haze. It was still too far away to identify clearly, but experienced eyes lingered on it longer than before. Crossing the European coastline brought the familiar psychological shift. Over the channel, there was still distance and a thin buffer of safety. Over occupied territory, that buffer disappeared. The navigator confirmed landfall in a calm voice, marking the moment on his chart. Below them, the dark patchwork of fields and waterways slid slowly beneath the bomber's shadow, barely visible through the thinning cloud. The first sign of German readiness came quietly. Through his headphones, the wireless operator began to detect increased enemy radar traffic. It was expected, but the pattern was heavier than usual, more organized, as though ground stations had locked onto the incoming stream earlier than anticipated. He passed the information forward without urgency, but the effect inside the aircraft was immediate and subtle. Focus sharpened, movements became slightly more deliberate. Outside, the distant flicker on the horizon grew brighter. What had initially resembled distant lightning began to resolve into something more structured. The light pulsed in steady intervals, too regular for weather. The navigator noticed it next, pausing briefly over his charts before leaning forward toward the canopy. Go searchlights. Still far ahead, still softened by distance, but unmistakable. The pilot made a small adjustment to his grip on the controls, barely noticeable, yet the co-pilot saw it and understood. Formation remained steady, engines ran smoothly, instruments showed no immediate problems. Yet the quiet confidence from earlier in the flight had begun to thin. German defenses were fully alert tonight. The intercom carried a few additional readiness checks. Gun positions confirmed. Oxygen flow verified again. Fuel calculations quietly rechecked against the extended route ahead. These were not signs of alarm, but of professional awareness. The crew had recognized the change in the environment. Below them, the first scattered bursts of anti-aircraft fire appeared in the distance, small, orange flashes blooming briefly against the darkness, far ahead of the mainstream. They were still well outside effective range, but their presence carried weight. German gunners were already probing the altitude bands, walking their fire upward in careful increments. The bomber continued forward into the deepening night. Inside the fuselage, conversation had faded almost completely now, replaced by the steady background of engine vibration and controlled breathing through oxygen masks. Each man remained focused on his instruments and responsibilities, but the earlier sense of routine had quietly disappeared. The mission was beginning to show its true shape. Crossing deeper into German-controlled airspace, but the night began to change in ways the crew could feel more than see. The scattered flak bursts ahead grew closer together, their dull orange blossoms rising steadily through the darkness. Inside the cockpit, the pilot maintained his measured posture, but his instrument scan tightened, eyes moving in quicker, more deliberate patterns across the panel. The bomber stream remained intact around them, yet the sky ahead had begun to feel crowded with intention. The navigator confirmed their position again, voice calm, but slightly more frequent now. Wind drift had shifted subtly, and he fed small heading corrections forward to keep the aircraft aligned with the narrow corridor planned for the approach. Each adjustment was minor on its own, but together, they formed the careful threading of a very large formation through heavily defended airspace. While beneath them, the faint outlines of towns and rivers slid slowly past in the darkness, invisible to the men inside the aircraft, except as marks on a chart. The first close flak burst came without warning. A sharp concussion rolled through the airframe, not violent enough to throw the aircraft off course, but strong enough to rattle loose equipment and draw immediate attention. The engineer's eyes snapped to his gauges. Engine temperatures steady, fuel pressure holding. He reported quickly and clearly, his tone controlled, but the message carried weight. They were now within effective range. Outside, the anti-aircraft fire thickened rapidly. What had been distant flashes became layered bursts at multiple altitudes, the German batteries walking their fire carefully into the bomber stream. With the sky ahead filled with expanding black puffs, rimmed in dull orange light. Each detonation left behind a hanging cloud that drifted slowly across the formation, forcing the pilot to begin making careful, measured adjustments. He resisted the urge to weave aggressively. Sudden maneuvering could scatter the formation and burn precious fuel. Instead, he introduced small heading changes and slight altitude corrections, just enough to slide the aircraft away from the densest concentrations. The co-pilot read back airspeed and altitude in a steady rhythm, giving the pilot the precise information needed to keep their movements controlled. Another burst detonated off the starboard side, close enough to slap the fuselage with flat pressure. The aircraft shuddered briefly. In the rear turret, the gunner watched the sky flicker continuously now. Each flak burst briefly, illuminating the shadowed forms of nearby bombers. The stream still held together, but the environment had turned unmistakably hostile. Over the intercom came brief reports from other crews in the formation: minor damage, maintaining position, holding course. The language remained professional and restrained, but the frequency of transmissions had increased. Everyone was feeling the pressure build. The bombardier double-checked his equipment again. Though the target was still minutes away, the tightening defenses meant there would be little margin for delay once the bombing run began. He adjusted his sight carefully, gloved fingers moving with practiced precision despite the growing vibration in the aircraft. The smell of cordite drifted faintly through the ventilation system. It carried upward from thousands of detonations below. A brighter flash erupted ahead as a bomber further along the stream took a near hit. For a moment, its silhouette dipped unevenly before stabilizing again, one engine glowing faintly but still running. The formation absorbed the disruption without breaking, the surrounding crews closing spacing slightly to maintain the protective flow. Inside their own aircraft, tension rose in quiet increments. The engineer reported a brief fluctuation in one engine's manifold pressure, then quickly confirmed it had returned to normal limits. The pilot acknowledged without looking away from the forward view. His hands remained steady on the controls, though the constant vibration from nearby bursts now traveled continuously through the control column. Searchlights began to appear below. At first, they were isolated beams probing upward through the haze, but within minutes, they multiplied into organized patterns. White fingers of light swept slowly across the sky, converging and separating in deliberate coordination. When one beam came close to their altitude, the pilot made a subtle adjustment to keep the aircraft just outside its strongest reach. The navigator marked the change and quietly recalculated their track. They were approaching the inner defensive belt now. Flak intensified further, bursting in thicker clusters that forced more frequent corrections. Each detonation carried the potential to tear through the thin aluminum skin that surrounded them. The crew's earlier sense of routine had completely vanished, replaced by the controlled, but professional focus of men fully aware that the mission had entered its most demanding phase. Still, the bomber pressed forward, engines droned with stubborn consistency. Instruments remained mostly within limits. Around them, the stream of aircraft continued its steady advance toward the distant industrial glow that now burned faintly on the horizon. Germany itself remained largely hidden beneath the darkness, but its defenses spoke clearly enough. Inside the cockpit, no one wasted words. The mission had diverged sharply from the calm expectations of the briefing room, and every man aboard understood it. Yet discipline held firm, procedure guided every movement, and mile by mile, through the tightening web of flak and light, the bomber continued deeper into the war. By the time the bomber stream reached the inner defensive belt, then the night over Germany had taken on a hard, deliberate clarity. The scattered flak bursts of earlier had matured into dense, carefully layered barrages, and the searchlights below no longer wandered aimlessly. They moved with coordination now, sweeping the sky in overlapping arcs that turned the darkness into something almost tangible. Beneath the haze, the industrial region ahead glowed faintly, a dull red smear spreading wider with every mile. Inside the aircraft, the change in atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. The wireless operator picked up the first concentrated signs of a German night fighter control traffic threading through the static. The transmissions came in clipped bursts, precise and frequent enough to suggest a network fully engaged. He passed the information forward in a calm voice, but the effect was clear. The flak was dangerous in its own way, but night fighters brought a different kind of threat, one that moved, watched, and adapted. The tail gunner leaned forward slightly in his turret. For long minutes he saw nothing but the layered darkness behind the formation. Then, during a brief flicker of distant searchlight glow, a shape appeared where no bomber should have been. It was only visible for a second. A twin-engine silhouette slipping low across the stream's wake. "Possible bandit, low 6, he reported quietly. The pilot did not break formation. Instead, he made a careful power adjustment, tightening their position within the bomber flow without drawing unnecessary attention. Around them, the stream held its disciplined shape, but inside the fuselage the tension rose by degrees. Within minutes more fighters appeared. They moved cautiously, using the flak bursts and darkness as cover, probing the edges of the formation rather than committing immediately. Tracer fire suddenly stitched the sky off the starboard side as another bomber in the stream came under attack. The struck aircraft shuddered visibly, dropping slightly before clawing its way back into position, one engine beginning to burn with a dull orange glow. Inside their own bomber, every man tightened into his role. The gunners increased their scan pattern, eyes moving in slow, disciplined sweeps to avoid fixation. The pilot maintained heading and altitude with deliberate precision. Sudden evasive movement now could create more danger than it avoided. The bombardier, already preparing for the upcoming run, checked his equipment again, though the target still lay ahead through smoke and haze. Another fighter attempted a cautious approach from below. The belly gunner reacted first, sending twin streams of tracer downward into the darkness. The aircraft vibrated as the guns fired, the sound sharp and mechanical against the constant engine drone. For a brief moment, the enemy aircraft's outline became visible in the crossing light, sleek, fast, already banking away. Whether hit or simply discouraged, it disappeared quickly. No one spoke about it. Encounters at night rarely provided clear answers. The pilot's voice came calmly over the intercom, reminding the crew to conserve ammunition and maintain disciplined watch. His tone remained steady, though the effort behind it was beginning to show in the tight control of his breathing. Around them, the sky had grown increasingly chaotic. The flak continued to rise in thick belts while searchlights probed relentlessly upward. Through it all, the night fighters circled with unsettling patience. Ahead, the target area's glow intensified. What had earlier been a faint smear was now a broad wash of red and orange on the horizon. Smoke from earlier strikes drifted upward in slow, towering columns that caught the searchlight beams and turned them into ghostly curtains. The navigator confirmed their timing, feeding the pilot small, precise corrections. The formation began its subtle compression for the bombing run. Spacing tightened. Speeds stabilized. Despite losses and damage, the bomber stream pulled itself into the disciplined shape required for accurate delivery. While it was one of the most dangerous moments of the mission, when predictability increased and maneuvering decreased, but training held the formation together. Inside the cockpit, the aircraft settled into that rigid forward commitment. Flak intensified again, the bursts now walking closer along the bomber approach lane. One detonation rocked the aircraft hard enough to rattle loose equipment. The engineer scanned his panel rapidly, but reported engines still holding within acceptable limits. For the moment, they remained fully operational. Another fighter probed from the rear, but the tail gunner's early warning allowed multiple bombers to bring defensive fire together. Tracer lines converged quickly, forcing the attacker to break away before closing distance. It slipped back into the layered darkness, patient, but denied. Inside the cockpit, the pilot allowed himself one slow breath. The mission had fully revealed its character. Nothing about the night resembled the calm expectations delivered in the briefing room hours earlier. Every mile had been contested, every phase more heavily defended than predicted. Yet the aircraft still flew. The engines held their steady rhythm. The crew remained coordinated and focused. And directly ahead, burning through the haze and smoke, the target area waited, growing larger with every second as the bomber pressed forward into the most dangerous stretch of the night.